Hello and welcome to the My School channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. So we're moving on to the topic military rule in Nigeria. I've divided this video lesson into two parts. So in the first part, we're going to begin with an introduction to military rule in Nigeria and discuss the first wave of military rule in Nigeria. Then in the second part, we will discuss the second wave. So please stay with us, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to My School channel. Like I said earlier, we are dividing this video into two parts. So in the first part, we are going to discuss the introduction to military rule in Nigeria and the first wave of military rule. So let's dive right into it. So here are a list of the topics that we're going to discuss. We're going to begin with the definition, characteristics of military rule. We're also going to discuss a case study of military rule in the 20th century. Then we're going to discuss the reasons for military intervention in Nigeria. We're going to discuss the various military regimes in Nigeria, the achievements and weaknesses of military rule, the reasons for the reluctance of military regimes to hand over power, and the processes of return to civilian rule. So let's begin with the definition of military rule. So military rule or dictatorship is a form of government where political power is concentrated in the hands of the military or a military leader. We discussed this a lot under the topic forms of government. So military rule is a form of government. It involves the military taking over power from civilian authority and handling the day-to-day operation of government. So in such a system, the military plays a dominant role in governing the country. They often take control through a coup d'etat or other forceful means. We're going to discuss a lot of these that occurred here in our Nigerian society. So military dictatorships are characterized by the direct involvement of the armed forces in political decision-making and the suppression of civilian governance. So when they take over power, they suppress civilian authority, those people who have been appointed into positions of authority by the people. They take them out of power and they take charge of the day-to-day governing of the nation. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so what are the characteristics of military rule? One of the characteristics is that power is concentrated in the hands of one or a few military leaders, e.g. a head of state or a ruling council. So in a military system of government, the head of state is usually a military leader, and he usually selects a group of military officers who take part in the decision-making process of the country. So these military officers who take part in this decision-making process is usually referred to as a ruling council. So military rulers also suspend or completely abolish the national constitution upon taking power. So this means that the constitution no longer takes hold in that society. The fundamental human rights are stipulated in the constitution. The forms, the structures of government, all of these are no longer relevant in such a society as the constitution has been suspended. Also, decisions are made unilaterally, mostly without public inputs or legislative debates. Given that the constitution has been suspended, the normal day-to-day running of government is also suspended as well. Decisions are made by this ruling council as well as the military head of state, and there is no legislative debate. The legislature no longer functions in such a society. It is military leaders who make laws within that society, and these laws are made by decree. Rule by decree replaces parliamentary lawmaking. So the laws in the country are no longer stipulated in the constitution, or the constitution that holds the laws in society no longer work. So the laws that work are the decrees that have been created and implemented by the military leaders. Also, fundamental rights and civil liberties may be suspended under decrees or emergency powers. The right to life, right to freedom of expression, right to freedom of the press, and so many other fundamental rights are suspended in this regime. So parliaments, political parties, and elections are usually dissolved, banned, or heavily controlled. So it depends on the military leader that is in power. So they are usually dissolved in most military regimes. So you no longer have parliament, the lawmaking body. Political parties are no longer allowed to function because there is no democratic elections in such a society. So all of these are characteristic of military rule. Now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, and that characteristic of military rule is that military regimes rely on coercion to maintain order and suppress dissent. So they actually make use of force to ensure that the people are kept in line. The people no longer have the right to make decisions in such a society, and in order to continue to hold power over the people, they have to make use of force. Leaders may be involved in corruption or human rights violation without fear of punishment or legal consequences. In such a society where the legislature no longer functions, and sometimes where the judiciary is also suspended, the leaders rule with impunity. There is no separation of power and no checks and balances as a result of that. So because of that, there is no legal consequences to their action. So they're usually not punished for every action that they take in such a society. So military officers also occupy key government positions in the ministries, the governorship positions, the administrative positions within society occupied by military officers. Freedom of speech, press, assembly, and movements may also be restricted. These are fundamental freedoms. Without such freedoms, the rights of the people will be severely violated. They are not allowed to speak against such oppressive governments. The press is not allowed to disseminate information in such a society. They are not even allowed to come together to discuss how decisions can be made in such a society. So this is characteristic of a military regime. Military regimes also often justify their rule as a way to restore discipline, to curb corruption, and stabilize the country. These are very common excuses that military leaders make when they assume power in a society. Military rulers are not elected and their rule lacks democratic legitimacy. They are not elected by the people, and in such a society, they do not have the acceptance, the legal backing of the people, so they are usually not legitimate leaders. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, now we're going to discuss military rule and the 20th century. We're going to look at how military rule was a very common system of government in the 20th century. So the rise of military rule in Nigeria was not an isolated event. This means that it's not just in Nigeria that we had military regimes. We had military regimes in several other different parts of the world during the 20th century. So during the 20th century, many countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and parts of Europe experienced military takeover. So these regimes emerged during times of political instability, weak civilian governments, or national crisis. So most of these societies are in third world countries, countries that have experienced decades of colonial rule. So in the post-colonial climate of these different countries, there have been a lot of emerging issues in their society, issues relating to political instability, corruption within the society, and also several different national crises. We also experienced all of this here in our Nigerian society. So examples of military rule in the 20th century include here in Nigeria, where we had the first coup in 1966, and then we had a military rule until 1979, where the military leader handed over power to civilian authority. Then again, we had military rule from 1983 to 1999. Then also in Ghana, their first coup took place in 1966 as well, with repeated takeovers until 1992. Then Uganda, military rule, they had military rule under Idi Amin, who ruled Uganda from 1971 to 1979. Then in Libya, we had Muammar Gaddafi, who came to power via a military coup in 1969 and was in power up until 2011. Then for South Korea, after independence, they experienced a coup in 1961 led by Park Chung-gi, who ruled South Korea until 1979. Then in Brazil, there was military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. So we see that military dictatorship is not an isolated event. It occurred in several post-colonial societies all around the world. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so while some military regimes brought temporary order, they were marked by suppression of civil liberties, lack of accountability, suspension of the constitution, weak institutional development, and human rights abuses. So you see a lot of these in military regimes all around the world. So what were the reasons military coups were common globally? One of the reasons is post-colonial fragility. So newly independent nations, especially in Africa and Asia, inherited weak political structures. The civilian governments were seen as corrupt and inefficient, and this created a space for the military to justify intervention. So this is an underlying theme across several post-colonial societies. Most of these societies inherited a weak political institution. Their system of government was not compatible with their society, and as a result, there were a lot of internal crises, and this was one of the justifications that the military leaders had to take over power from civilian authorities. Now let's move on to another reason. And that reason was Cold War politics. During the Cold War, military regimes were supported by either the United States or the Soviet Union. So depending on their alignment, the superpowers preferred stable authoritarian allies to counter each other's influence. Some of these societies were dragged into the Cold War conflict that was going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so when they got dragged into it, these superpower nations needed military leaders to be able to take charge of these different countries so that they can continue to align with their interests. So this is another reason for military rule in several different parts of the world, but not here in Nigeria. The Cold War politics is not a reason for military intervention here in our Nigerian society. Let's move on to another reason. And that reason is the internal conflicts that were going on within these post-colonial societies. So there were ethnic, religious, or ideological tensions, e.g. in Sudan, in Pakistan, and in Chile, which made democratic governance difficult. The military presented itself as a neutral and disciplined force to restore order. So right here in Nigeria, our problem was ethnic and religious crisis. So we were divided along ethnic lines, and this continued to create a chain of political instability within our society. And this was the justification for military leadership in the country. In other parts of the world, it is usually ideological tension. So this is another reason for military intervention. Now let's move on to another reason. Okay, there was also economic crisis. When inflation, unemployment, or food shortages occurred, people lost confidence in elected leaders. Military leaders would step in, claiming they could restore economic stability. So they felt that they had that discipline that was needed to ensure that the country is restored back to its former glory. So this also occurred here in Nigeria. In Nigeria, we're also having economic issues within the country, and the military justified their takeover with this fact. They believed that they could restore discipline and solve some of the economic issues within the country. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to discuss the reasons for military intervention here in Nigeria. One of the major reasons for military intervention is tribal loyalty. So Nigeria in the First Republic was divided along ethnic lines. Leaders selected to represent the regions made decisions that prioritized the interests of their region over national unity. So we had a lot of crises within the country as a result of tribal loyalty. Most of these people that were meant to represent the entire nation in the National Assembly and in various governmental positions did not represent the interest of the entire nation. Rather, they represented the interests of their various regions. So this led to a lot of political instability within the country. And that reason for intervention is the politicization of the army. The Nigerian military, which was supposed to be neutral, became involved in political affairs. Senior officers began to form alliances with politicians and took sides in political conflicts. So promotions and appointments were influenced by ethnic and political considerations. So normally in a society, in a democratic society, the army, the military is meant to be neutral. They are not meant to side with any political party within the country. They are meant to be loyal to whatever government is sitting in power. But this was not the case in our Nigerian society. Our army was politicized. They were promoted and they were appointed based on their loyalty to a political party. So this was one of the reasons for military intervention in Nigeria. And that reason is the dispute over census results. So the 1962 and 1963 population censuses were marred by manipulation and regional bias as population figures determine federal allocations. So we're also going to discuss a lot about fiscal federalism in our Nigerian society. Allocation of revenue at the central level to the various regional authorities was dependent on the number of people living in these different regions. And because these regions were aware of this fact, they marred the population census results in 1962, and this led to the conducting of another census in 1963. When the 1963 census was conducted as well, people also claimed that the figures were padded by these different regions. So this contributed to the crisis within the nation, and this was one of the justifications for military intervention in the country. We're going to discuss a lot more on this under the topic political crisis in Nigeria. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, and that reason for military intervention is the general election crisis of 1964. The federal election of 1964 were marred by irregularities. The United Progressive Grand Alliance, or UPGA, boycotted the election in the East due to allegations of electoral fraud. And this led to a lack of national legitimacy for the federal government under Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa. There was meant to be an election conducted in 1964. But most of the people in the East did not take part in the election, and so the prime minister that was elected at the end of the day was not fully legitimate. This also contributed to military intervention in 1966. And that reason is the Action Group crisis of 1962. The action group became divided due to leadership struggles between Obafemi Awolowo and Samuel Ladoke Akintola. So the federal government intervened, declared a state of emergency, and imposed an administrator on the western region. So this interference deepened regional sentiment and weakened civilian authority. The fact that a state of emergency was declared in a democratic society contributed to the political instability within the country. And that reason is the Western Nigeria election crisis of 1965. So the regional elections in Western Nigeria were heavily rigged, leading to violence, arson, and killings. So this period was referred to as Operation Wete. This region descended into anarchy with the government losing control over law and order. We're going to discuss more of this under the topic political crisis as well. These were the reasons for military intervention in Nigeria in 1966. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, and that reason for military intervention is the allegation of corruption, nepotism, and sectionalism. The First Republic politicians were widely seen as corrupt. They diverted public funds to personal accounts or used them for regional gains. So nepotism and sectionalism were also rampant. These practices eroded public trust and gave the military an excuse to intervene. So there was a lot of corruption going on in society. There was nepotism and sectionalism as well, in the sense that so many different appointments into political offices were based on regional loyalty. And this also contributed to the problems that were going on within the country. And that reason for military intervention is the mismanagement of public funds. Civilian governments were accused of misusing national revenue. Large-scale development programs were mismanaged or abandoned, and budget deficits grew. The economy was not delivering the expected post-independence progress despite abundant resources. So public funds were mismanaged by those in power. And so some of the projects that they began were not concluded. And this led to a lot of budget deficits within the society. So this is one of the economic reasons for intervention within our Nigerian society. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so here is a list of the military regimes that occurred in Nigeria from 1966 to 1999. So the first military regime was headed by Major General Aguiyi Ironsi, and then he had his deputy, who was also the chief of staff. So the chief of staff in this different military regime was the vice head of state. If anything happens to the head of state, it is usually the chief of staff who takes over in the governing of the country. So Brigadier Babafemi Ogundipe was the deputy or the chief of staff. And Major General Aguiyi Ironsi was in power from January 16th, 1966 to July 29th, 1966. Then we had General Yakubu Gowon, his Vice Commodore Joseph Way. He was in power from August 1st, 1966 to July 29th, 1975. Then we have General Murtala Mohammed and Brigadier Olusegun Obasanjo, who was his vice. They were in power from July 29th, 1975 until the assassination of General Murtala Mohammed on February 13th, 1976. So after the assassination of Murtala Mohammed, General Olusegun Obasanjo took over. His rank in the military has been changed to general. Then his deputy became Major General Shehu Musa Yaradua. He was in power from 1976 up until October 1st, 1979, when he handed over power back to civilian rule. So this ended the first wave of military rule in Nigeria. And then we have Major General Muhammadu Buhari taking over power from Alhaji Shehu Shagari. And then his deputy Brigadier Tunde Idiagbon. They were in power from December 31st, 1983 up until August 27th, 1985. This is when General Ibrahim Babangida took over from Buhari. He had two different deputy or chiefs of staff, Commodore Ebutu Okiwe from 1985 to 1986 and Admiral Augustus Aikomu from 1986 to 1993. He was there from August 27, 1985 to August 26, 1993 when he stepped down and handed over power to the interim government led by Chief Ene Shonekon. Then General Sani Abacha took over power from Chief Ene Shonekon, and he had his deputy as Lieutenant General Oladipo Odiya. He was in power from November 17, 1993 up until June 8, 1998 when he died in office. Then General Abdusalami Abubakar took over from him, and then his deputy chief of staff became Rear Admiral Mike Akigbe. He was in office from June 9, 1998 up until when he handed over power to civilian rule on May 29th, 1999. So these are the list of the various military regimes in Nigeria, and we've come to the end of this segment of the video lesson. I believe it was educative and insightful. If you would like to continue on this journey with us, please go down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website where you can continue on this journey with us. There we are going to discuss the various military regime that was in the first wave of military rule, from Major General Johnson Aguiyi down to General Olusegun Obasanjo. We are going to discuss their regimes in detail. We're going to discuss the key policies that they introduced during their time and the various events that occurred while they were in power. So I hope to see you there. I believe you're enjoying this content. If yes, please don't forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release next videos.